May the words of my mouth, the meditations of my heart be acceptable in your sight, O God, my rock and my redeemer. First of all, I'd just like to thank you for Carla and myself for welcoming us into your church, to your family. We sort of showed up last July, beggars at the doorstep, and you guys brought us in. You've been incredibly nice to us, very kind. You've let us do a couple of things to help out, and we feel really blessed to be part of you, and we just want to say thanks. So thank you very much for letting us be part of this. So I'm going to start off with a favorite story from the Lloyd household. This is really true. So when our son Dominic was little, he's 28 now, but when he was little, we bought him these tapes of Superman. Not him, sorry. That was Superman. We bought him these tapes of Superman, the 1930s and 40s cartoons. And he loved these tapes. And he would watch them over and over. You guys have probably seen them before. They're like lots of primary colors, lots of evildoers always taking over the world, threatening to, and lots of times when Superman would come and save the day. And Dominic, our son, used to say that his favorite time was that moment of change. You know, the moment when, Clark Kent, the mild-mannered reporter from the Daily Planet would get, he reached the end of his rope, and just get so frustrated, run to the phone booth, run to the closet or whatever, and would come out in the trumpets on these cartoons. The trumpets would blast out this big fanfare, and you would hear, "This is the time for dun 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 dun." Everybody, Superman, yes. We could do a little better than that. So this is the time for dun 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 dun. We have to wait for the drum. Dun 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 dun. Here we go. Superman. That was good. He loved those things. And so one time when he was about 3, and I was working at the newspaper in Syracuse, and back then we were the uniforms was we wore coats and ties. I came home from work one day, and I go in the bedroom to change, and Dominic followed me in. And so I take off my tie, and all of a sudden I hear from behind me, "Dad!" And I turn around, and his eyes are this big. He goes, "Are you getting ready to turn into Superman?" If only I could turn into Superman. So I was reminded of that story when I read the readings for it today, knowing that we would be having this conversation. They have many, many messages, but the one thing that struck me about all these messages today is this idea of change, of being transformed. In the Old Testament, or the Hebrew writings, if you prefer, Moses had to come down and get from Mount Sinai, where he had been face to face with God. And he was getting the 10 Commandments when that happened. And so when he comes down, his face is so bright that all the fellow wanderers, all the Jews that were with him, they couldn't stand it. It was just too bright. And so they asked him to put the veil over his face to hide it. He had met with God. He had been in God's presence. He had spoken with God. And the experience of being in that presence had made him different. He had changed. Now that story is so important that if you go to the letter of Paul to the church of Corinth, the second letter of Paul, 2 Corinthians, or as Donald Trump will say, 2 Corinthians, Paul criticizes the Hebrews because he said they had a veil over their hearts. So Paul had taken the veil from being the outside, and we talked about the veil being on the inside. He tells all these new Christians that when they turn to God, they had had their own personal trip up the mountain, so to speak. God had taken that veil away. They had taken away the veil from the inside. And so that experience of turning to God, of speaking with God, of praying, if you will. That means that the Corinthians, as Paul said in the reading, they are being transformed. That's a direct quote. And they're changed into another direct quote, into the image of God. Now, traditionally, what we understand is the image of God is not that we look like God on the outside, but that we get to look like Him on the inside of ourselves. And so that means that we have the same nature as God. We get to love what He loves, we get to cling to the goodness that He's created, and we get to avoid it behaving ways that are unsuitable. We get to change. So then when you come to the gospel of today, the gospel is one of those stories that is so prominent that it has its own name. It's called the Transfiguration. In fact, today is Transfiguration Sunday. And here Jesus transfigures, changes, if you will, into His true nature of God. And He's visited by Moses and Elijah. And some of the disciples are there, 3 of them were there, and they're fortunate they get to witness this. Now, if you read the readings, look at them, it's really comical, sort of, that the 3 disciples, they get to see 2 of the most prominent figures in the Old Testament, Moses and Elijah. And their first thought is not, I'm witnessing a miracle, but let's build 3 churches. And of course, I could just see it if this was the internet. They would all be huddled around their iPhones, checking out their new app on where crowdsourcing, because you have to raise money. And instead of missing this incredible miracle that is occurring at the moment. If they had said, let's form a committee, you would know beyond a doubt they would have been Episcopalians. Still, in all seriousness, one of the lessons of the Transfiguration is that God reveals Himself to humans. And that the humans, by the end of the day's passage, they finally get it. And they were humble, and they were changed by it. Now, I was in middle school. We called it junior high back then. But I was in middle school, and I started to notice that there were behaviors in my life that I didn't like very much. And I wanted desperately to be popular. I really did. And most of the people do at that age. But I found that I just kept getting in my own way. So I decided to change. I decided on my own I was going to be a better person. And it did not work. For the life of me, the more I tried, the worse it got. I seemed to be just powerless to become this someone different, someone better, to change. And I don't think I'm that much different from anybody here in this room. All of us in this room would like to change something about ourselves. For many, some, we could shed a few pounds, except for my wife, who's beautiful just the way she is. Some of us could use a nice job. Some of us probably would like better hair. Maybe we'd like a better job, more money, nicer relatives, a warmer climate, a spouse, a partner, a boyfriend, a girlfriend, maybe a dog. Most of these are within our power to change. But you really have to be careful about what you wish for. Because some of these are outward changes, and they may seem like the answer to make us happier, but they really wouldn't. I remember being a month away from being married one time, and my then fiance called it off a month before the wedding. At the time, I was devastated and couldn't see it, but it led me right to my wife today, which is, thank God for that. And that was something that was incredibly meaningful. But that's not really what's going on in these readings. The transformations that are lasting, Paul says, is the stuff that happens on the inside, being transformed into the image of God. And again, in our most honest moments, the ones that we really have that come to Jesus moment, all of us, if we're really honest with ourselves, will admit that there are things inside of us that could really change. We could be better. Some of us could be a better spouse. Some of us could be less bossy, less insistent that we insist on having things our own way. Some of us could be less stingy, not with our money only, but also with our time. Some of us say really awful things about other people. I myself have committed every one of them. I have done every one of those. Everyone's behavior embarrasses them at some point. We've all at some time will be needed to be less human and more godlike, more different, more changed, if you will. And so the question is before us. How do we make those changes? How do we change on the inside? To those of us who studied the world religions, one of the many similarities that they share is a call for surrender of sorts. Sort of a giving up of oneself to a higher power. A recognition that there's something much bigger than us. There's really big. My students used to say to each other, it's not about you. That sort of recognition. You even see this sector when you go to organizations like AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, where a very early and a very important step in their 12-step program is submitting to a higher power. For Christians, for us, the answer lies in the Moses story today. The higher power is very clear. We surrender to God. Moses had to go up. He had to see God by himself. It was just Moses and God. He went to a meeting, went for several meetings, and just as a person, and he came back a changed man. So following Moses' example, all of us, we need to go see God by ourselves, so to speak. We need to have our own meeting up on the mountain. Moses famously had to take off his sandals because he was on holy ground, a sign of humbling himself. And in the same way, we have to admit that we need to improve our lives, that we have to ask God to help us change. And I'm not claiming to be an expert on any of this, but if I were God, that would be one of those prayers that would be really, really easy to say yes to. It's not, we're asking to be better people. We're not asking for mistakes. We're saying we want to be a better person. And so that brings us back to Superman. God did not give us superpowers. Bullets don't bounce off our chest. We don't leave tall buildings at a single bound. We don't get to fly. But He did give us something that can be just as formidable. And that's the power of choice. And that power of choice is almost superhuman. It's up to us whether we face the truth and ask God to help us change. It's our choice whether we heed the call to surrender. God has given us the right to choose our own path. So it is my request, O beloved ones, O fellow wanderers, that we make that choice of change, that we ask God to help us do so. And so sometime during the rest of today's service, just steal a private moment, one of those private times that's just between you and God, and ask Him to help you change, to help us all change. And if in doing so, while we're in the middle of the rest of the service, if somehow we hear, maybe faintly from across the room, or maybe a little louder from the person next to us, this faint sound, dun, 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 I think we'll all know it's working.